Hi, everyone, and welcome. It's Lizzie here from Zero to Revenue, and I'm joined by John. John, give us a wave.
Hello.
Or drink your tea. I mean, we see how we queued that up perfectly. So John is joining us today. He is CEO of Administrate, John Peebles. And Administrate are a training management platform, and they're one of Scotland's fastest growing tech companies. So John, with that kind of intro, I'd love to unpick a little bit more about your journey to date, what led you to being CEO of Administrate today?
Yeah, so I think there was no real career planning or path of any kind. It was an accidental journey in many ways. I joined Administrate back about 7 years ago when I moved to Scotland as the chief operating officer. And that had been kind of my skill set prior. And I really liked the solution that Administrate was trying to solve. Came on board with a couple of guys who had taken a product that had been built actually as an internal tool within a training company. And they said, hey, we think we've got a market here, raised a little bit of investment, brought me on board, and off we went. And as part of that, they kind of figured out that they didn't really like the growing of the company as much. They liked the starting bits a bit more. And so actually relatively quickly, they decided to move on to different things. And that's kind of how I became the CEO. So, and here we are. They're still stuck with me 7 years later.
It's really interesting to hear people who are aware of what stage they love to be in, right? You often hear the scale of, we're all on a scale of 1 to 10, right? So are you the people who are in the 1 to 2 stage? Are you a 3 to 4? Are you a 9 to 10? So I guess that was an interesting point where they kind of stepped back from that role to let you take that. How did that play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of those things that is very difficult to understand until you've actually been through those transitions. So I'm a good example of that. My previous company, we went through, you started with just a few people and grew it to about 120 people over a 4 or 5 year period. And when I then transitioned from that role into Administrate, which was back to kind of the 2, 3, 4 people, I hadn't really realized that I did not enjoy early stage startups. Right. And, so it's exciting, but it's also terrifying in many ways. And and I think as Administrate grew, we went through a transition period 2, 3 years ago where we were moving from kind of 15, 20 people up to 40, 50 people. And we had a crew of people who were there at the beginning that were just saying, you know what, somebody literally said, I miss the days when the entire company ran through me personally. Yeah. And so those people went on to other things and they left. And at the time it was kind of like, well, is this a problem and whatever, but all of those people went back to kind of micro startups where they were more comfortable. So I just think it's not right or wrong. Me personally, not until you get to 50, 60 people do I start to feel comfortable. And, but I'm sure there'll be a point where I'm like, this is too big and bloated and I hate this and so on. So you really do have to experience it though, in order to figure that one out. I don't think you can read a book and decide.
Right. So testing it, finding out what your comfort zone is. And I guess self-reflection and awareness is a large part of that, is knowing, am I just uncomfortable because, things are tough, or is actually this not my real skill set?
Yeah. Yeah. And it is a skill set, right? I mean, the skills that you need to manage a complex budget of millions of pounds or dollars is very different from, eking the best out of, your 200-pound budget or whatever. It's not right or wrong. It's just very, very different skill set, and people will thrive in an area where they'll die in one of the other phases.
So I'm really interested in that journey where you came on board, obviously with lots of decisions having to be made, whether that was business model, direction, culture, and maybe it was tech stack. Which ones of those were particularly hard to kind of evaluate and then decide on a different direction?
So, yeah, I mean, I think for us, we're a B2B software platform, and that means that there are a whole number of business model decisions and so on that are kind of removed from consideration. So that's nice, right? I mean, B2B is a lot simpler in many ways to get off the ground than B2C. those decisions were a little bit easier. And because it was an internal product and so on, we already had a tech stack and so on. Now, I disliked a number of those choices and we have had to make some difficult technical decisions in order to, move to where we are today. And those were challenging. But I think for us, the biggest challenge that we went through was I made a fairly crucial mistake early on. And that is, I'd come from the healthcare industry in the United States, which is big dollar sales. I mean, you're talking average sale price for healthcare tech applications is usually 6 figures, if not 7 or higher. Long sales processes, a lot of compliance and certification, all that type of thing. And, I had this dream in my head that we could, not do that, right? We'd have a self-service platform and so on. And so when I came on board with Administrate, this wasn't just my sole dream, but I definitely was bitten by this bug. And the idea was, we've got this platform, we'll make it as simple as possible and as cheap as possible and have a mass market product, kind of like Free Agent that has done with their accounting software. And we chased this dream for probably 3-4 straight years. And it wasn't until about 2 years ago that I felt like I woke up one day and just thought, you know what, we need to embrace who and what we are. And that is, we are a big, complex, very featureful software platform that takes months to install, that can deliver huge value, but it is a classic enterprise, high dollar sales point product. And so we had to then change the posture of the entire company. We had to bring in new teams. We had to change our roadmap to support enterprise features and so on. And I think it just goes back to that kind of quadrant of doom where you've got, low complexity, high complexity on one axis, and you've got low cost, high cost on the other. And we were firmly within, like most startups, within the quadrant of doom where we had a high complexity, low cost product, or that we were pricing low. And, it doesn't matter whether you're in the quadrant of doom, it just matters how you're trying to get out of the quadrant. What's your strategy to move out of that? And for us, we tacked left, meaning we tried to go to less complexity, lower cost, when we should have actually been tacking up and getting to the high cost, high complexity axis. And that was just a really big mistake that cost years and millions of pounds that we probably could have invested a little bit better. So that, I think, was the most difficult decision. In hindsight, it's ridiculous because we had problems with churn. We had customers not being able to get set up, all of this stuff, all of the data was right there in front of us. I just couldn't see it. And, so that was probably the most difficult transition we had to go through in terms of the decision.
It's really amazing hearing you talk about a mistake and recognizing that and looking back and saying, the data was right in front of me. How much of that was it ego? Was it you having to be like, well, I've got this vision and I need to be going in that direction, so it doesn't matter, we're going hell for leather like this. What was the makeup of that for you, and kind of what eventually broke that down?
I think, I've got a massive ego, and it must be fed continuously, right? So I'm sure there was a lot of ego involved. I don't think that it was necessarily like a pride thing or like, this is right or wrong. I think it's more about with startups, you tend to commit original sins that then last for years. And you sometimes don't even realize how important these early decisions are. And so, it's coming out of the idea that the software had been built within a small training company that's kind of data point one. It had started off at a very low price point. And one of the mistakes that you tend to see a lot with UK startups in particular is they rely very heavily on a lot of consulting revenue. And so what was happening was they were supporting this very low priced product with very large amounts of consulting revenue. And then when we said, well, we're going to strip that out, all of a sudden so these original sins were kind of there, and it's a lot of inertia, and it is very difficult to change, your strategy once things have been set. So I think I understand why we went on the journey we did, but I think it's just one of those cautionary things. I've been involved in some other early stage startups where you can see them not adhering to kind of a pattern. And if you call it out early, it's easy to change. But once you've raised money and put a business plan in front of people and called the play, it can be very difficult to just change that inertia, if that makes sense. So I think it's just that is the function of that's why you're supposed to be well read, and that's why you're supposed to have advisors that have done this before around you as a startup, because they can pattern match against those things and at least ask the questions. They'll not always be right, but you can at least ask the questions and try to head those mistakes off.
So thinking about those advisors, how do you go about surrounding yourself with people who are supportive, yet usefully cynical and critical? You yourself when you're CEO, but also how do you encourage your team to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard question to answer, right? People are constrained by geography, they're constrained by what industries they're operating with, and so on. But I would just say, if you can find somebody that's ahead of you on the journey, particularly the startup journey, that is really valuable. I mean, I even tell people, don't start a company right when you're out of college, or don't make it your first thing. Get experience in a startup first and learn on somebody else's dime and watch all the mistakes that they're making. And then after you got a few years of that under your belt, go and try to start your thing. And that's just a shorthand way of saying you can get some advice, or you can observe some mistakes and so on. So I think it's really important to have people that are ahead of you on the journey. We, for example, have Ed on our board. He's the CEO of Free Agent. And I was actually at an event with him last night. We were talking about, when he joined about 3-4 years ago. When he joined, Free Agent was about the same size that we are today, and we were much smaller. And I think that's just how it's supposed to work. You need active CEOs that you can call up and talk to, because it is a very strange and wonderful job. And you gotta find them. But I think one thing I've found is that if you approach these people and you just say, hey, I'm doing this thing and I'm trying to learn and get advice and so on, they'll be very open and willing to invest and take that call. So just don't be afraid of it.
Yeah, you can. It can't hurt to ask, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, and I've never really, sometimes you get a no, but a lot of times it's just, I can't do it right now, but let's have a coffee or a beer or whatever. And particularly in Edinburgh, we got a really good ecosystem that I think is developing a tradition of helping each other out. So it's we're pretty lucky in that regard.
Those are definitely some of the benefits of the ecosystem and the supportive network. And I would love to dig in with you. Your reaction when I first asked you, hey, do you want to speak at this Zero to Revenue Challenge thing that we're doing? You definitely brought up the challenges of the hustle, perceptive, and the whole idea of, well, we've got to kind of go boom or go bust. I would love to hear more from you about, like, what is your resistance to that kind of culture and what is damaging about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that we feel like at Administrate we are trying to prove. And the first is that you can build an amazing startup without working yourself to death or doing so in an unsustainable way. And so I think that's rooted in the fact that I'm a workaholic, that I tend to be very good at working very intensely for long periods of time. And I'm very good at getting people to do that as well. And I've seen where, you take a step back after a decade of those types of habits, and you're like, wow, did I really make people's lives better? And what's really the goal here? And for us, for me, it's the goal of making our customers' lives a lot better, and same thing for our team and building a work environment that people love. So I kind of instinctively recoil against the hustle porn that you see, where I think people have seen on LinkedIn, people post stuff like, got up at 4:30, went to the gym, did all this stuff on a plane. It's just kind of like, the problem with that is that these startups take 10 to 15 years to really get to where everybody wants to go. I mean, you look at all of the startups that everybody talks about, Uber, Airbnb, whatever, and these are 10-year-old companies now, and they're still not where they want to be. And so if it's going to take 10 to 15 years, how are you going to live your life so that, one, you don't waste it, and two, you are not leaving a trail of human consequence behind you? And so that's kind of the one thing we're trying to prove. And the other thing we're trying to prove is that just by succeeding and surviving, you are an outlier as a startup. And it's not, you don't have to build, like, becoming a unicorn is in itself not a goal. In our view. And my view is that we want to serve the market that we have, and we want to do so in a really powerful way. And it just so happens that our market is big enough that if we do that well, we should have a great financial success. But for us, we're focused on, let's solve the problem first and foremost. And things like funding rounds and so on that tend to garner a lot of press in the startup world are not things that we believe should be celebrated. So we talk about all the time with our team, when we do a funding round, it's a lot of times it's just a relief to be done because we can get back to running our business, but also it's just gas or petrol, as we say in the UK, in the tank. And we're trying to get to a destination, and you need petrol, but apart from that, there's not really anything to say. So with all of that, I think there's this tendency, more and more, where people are reading blog posts and so on, and they have this idea that being in a startup is a lifestyle, and so on. And so I kind of, just like with the hustle porn stuff, I kind of recoil against startup cosplay, where it's like, the example that I like to give is, I was reading this article in the New Yorker a while back, and it was talking about writers who go out and do writering. And the idea is that they go to cafes, and they wear tweed coats, and they drink really nice coffee, and they might even carry around a typewriter and lots of moleskin notebooks, and they do all the things that writers do except for actually write. And same thing with startups. You don't want to be in that startupping mode, and instead you want to be building a business that's helping customers, and hopefully at some point we'll have a financial result that's positive. And so that's the thing that when I meet with founders and with startups, and when we talk about it internally with our employees, we talk about, we need to have joy in the journey and sustainable practices along the way, and also don't lose sight of the goal.
Yeah, I can definitely appreciate, I hadn't heard it put like that, writering, going to do it, but not actually doing the thing. And I know what you mean. I can definitely picture like, startup founders are always on the go. You've got your MacBook, you're plugged in, you're doing whatever startup founders do, but are you actually building a business? And I think core to what you've just said there is that if you're always staying true to what are we delivering for our customers and why, then that should keep us on the straight and narrow. Definitely something I struggle with all the time is you have the list of things that you've decided you have to do, and I never have any idea, are these the right things that I should be working on, or are they not? And it's that constant fear of, but there are these other 20 things that you could be doing or you should be doing. And for me anyway, circling back around and keeping that customer at the forefront helps alleviate that. So you're doing it for a reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's very insidious too. The idea of, you're going to conferences and you're meeting with customers and you're going to talk with funders and so on. You see it where I've got friends who live in small towns in America, and they'll text me and they'll say, "Where in the world are you today?" Right? And that's kind of that, what they're really saying is, wow, you've got this glamorous lifestyle and so on. And I'm like, well, okay, I do understand that I was in Toronto, and then our office in Bozeman, and then out in the Valley for a conference, and then visiting a customer in Pennsylvania, and so on. And it does look very glamorous until you actually do it. And then, you know, it's that Instagram lifestyle that it's not really real, and so on, and it can be very insidious. So, but yeah, I think to your question of are you really moving the needle on for your customers and for your team? It's a hard one because there's always the urgent and then there's the important, and they're usually at odds. You've got to be very familiar and comfortable with the idea of unfinished work at a startup. And I like to say that when I was growing up, I get on the school bus to go to school, and I would start doing the work for my first class on the school bus. And then I'd get in my first class and I would do the work for my second class. And that's how I did my homework for years. And, you know, that's a very bad study habit and makes you very unsuccessful in school in general. And yet that's a very useful habit to have in being able to work under huge pressure with very tight deadlines and so on is a very good habit to have in a startup. And so, you know, it's just one of those things where it's a very strange way of working to a lot of people.
How have you developed in terms of your understanding of how you work best and working with people who work very differently from you? Has that been a challenge?
You know, it has been a little bit. I think one of the things that I was really lucky is that early on I read a book called Peopleware, which was published in kind of late 70s, early 80s, I think. And basically it's one of the best, I would say, books to read about managing software teams or knowledge worker teams, which is what a lot of software startups are. And it talks a lot about studies that were done about worker productivity and workplace and so on. And basically everything that we do today with office design and so on is terrible. And actually it has been demonstrated through scientific studies that open plan offices are the worst possible thing for productivity. People need a quiet spot to focus and turn off things like Slack. I mean, Slack is the biggest productivity killer you can possibly have. It's way worse than email. And you know, you need to have that focus time where you can actually work and focus on one thing. You know, it's amazing. Humans are not good at multitasking. We all think we're okay. And in fact, there's actually some studies that have been done that show that millennials believe that they are much better at multitasking than other generations, and they're not. And so we actually talk about that at Administrate. It's very hard to do. Like last 2 all hands meetings, we've talked about, you know, the importance of, you know, blocking out distractions and so on. We reconfigured our office so that each development team has their own pod. And then you're walking down the hall and yet the doors are still open to these pods. And you're like, okay. And so it's very hard to change the idea. And people think, well, we're supposed to be collaborating and all this stuff. And it's like, yes, there's a time for collaboration. And usually you're just collaborating with 1 or 2 people. And I've never actually injected anything of value by just overhearing something in an open plan office and jumping in. So yeah, I think a lot of that is stuff that we get wrong as startups. Open plan offices photograph much better. They look much nicer, but they're terrible for productivity and actually getting stuff done.
Do you think part of that then really has to be though on what stage of the journey you're at? And definitely as well to your point of, you know, getting up at 4 and working all the hours. And I'm sure I can hear the devil's advocate on my shoulder saying, you know, but sometimes you have to, or at some stages you have to, or for some pinch points you have to. Do you subscribe to that? Do you think there's a time and a place and it's just about, okay, but what is sustainable? What can you do for the long term? Yeah. Or do you think it is possible to build in a sustainable and a balanced manner?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that you know, we try to hire high performers in Administrate. I think all of our team are exceptionally high performers, and the problem with high performers is they love to work and they're very passionate about what they do, and it's a craft to them, and so actually they'll want to work much longer than really you want them to, or they should. So that's kind of problem number 1, and problem number 2 is you do have to burst from time to time. Right now, we work a 4-day week at Administrate, 4 days, 32 hours, and we pay everybody for 5. But right now we have 2 dev teams that are working the next 3 Fridays. in order to finish for a deadline for the end of the quarter. They're working today and the next two. And that's something they decided to do on their own. They said, we need to get this done. The only option that we can see is to just put in a little additional time. And so they are, and that's okay, but it's not okay if we don't have light at the end of the tunnel. And it's not okay if we're saying that needs to be 6 months, right? 3 days is one thing over 3 weeks, but 6 months is more of a systemic managerial problem. That just means we're not resourcing things correctly. So I think you always have the bursting stuff that needs to happen, but it just needs to fit within that broader sustainable framework. And you need to be careful because it is seductive. We do like to work more, and that's not healthy or beneficial to the business long term.
Yeah, and definitely what you have to say about high performers there rings true to me. Whenever I get challenged on how do you work with a remote team, how do you know if they're working, I always say, why haven't you trusted your hiring process, that you're hiring the right people, that of course they want to be working because they believe in what you're building. Yeah. And actually our biggest problem is to enable people to have that free time, to stop work, to have time off. So that definitely speaks true to that. How do you manage the people's equating what they do and what their output is with what they're worth and what their value is?
That's a good question. I don't know that we specifically manage that. I think that it is, great performing teams or high performing teams love winning, and they do it fairly frequently. So I think, the results, we tend to manage by results and really focus on that. It's that thing, right? There was that guy a couple of years ago that, he's never in the office, and they found out that he had hired a Chinese guy to do all of his work, and the Chinese guy just VPN'd into his office, and they fired the guy. And I'm like, that is the wrong conclusion, right? Like they should have given that guy a team and, figured out what was going on. And I think that's more about what we try to instill at Administrate. It's the results that really matter. We don't care how you get there, as long as you're within the context of our values, right? And actually we should celebrate people who find the time to kick back because they've completed everything. That doesn't happen a lot with us, though. I think there's this image of, okay, we're only working, we're working 20% less time. The number one thing that we tell people in our hiring process is this is going to be the hardest place you've ever had to work. And it's not going to be hard because you're working long hours or somebody's shouting at you or whatever. It's going to be hard because you're not going to believe the pace or the quality expectations that are put on you. And everybody laughs in an interview when I say that. And I said, look, you're laughing right now, in about 30 to 60 days, you're completely overwhelmed, and you're gonna be like, oh man, I'm super overwhelmed. And you're gonna tell your manager, and they're just gonna say, welcome to the NBA, and that's how it goes. And everyone has gone through that.
And I definitely get that kind of the stepping up and leveling up point, but is that the end of the conversation? That's how it goes? Like you gotta be able to hack it, or is it okay, but here's what we do to help you step up?
Yeah, there is support, but it is also the realization that we're not for everybody, right? Yeah. And we're not for everybody at every stage of life either. So I think we try to basically, I think we do a good job of saying, these things are achievable, and people go through seasons of life that are not great. At any given time, we got 80 people now. At any given time, there are people going through divorce. There are people who have had deaths in their family. There are lots of really scary, sometimes evil, just horrible shit that people are kind of wading through. So when that happens, we talk about, look, we don't need to know the specifics, right? But you do need to flag to your team and to your manager, I'm going through something that's tough, right? Because otherwise what happens is you start going through something tough and your work performance just starts going down, right? And if you don't talk about it, or you don't flag that, then your manager starts getting on you, or your team starts getting on you a little bit, and then your performance goes down even further because now you're stressed and now you're under the gun in addition to the whatever other problems there are. And so for us at Administrate, we have tried to face up to the fact that mental health is a really big challenge, just in general, but actually in startups, you're something like 2 times, 3 times more likely to have a mental health issue. Younger people are more likely to have mental health issues than older people, and you put those together. We've got a lot of young people in a startup, and it's not a great recipe. So we've done some things like we bring in a mental health certified therapist. I think it's once a week, and she's got slots that our team can go and talk freely and anonymously. So we don't know who goes. We have no idea, what's discussed. It's obviously a legal thing, but we've got that available, and that has been a huge help for our team. So we try to surround people with the mental support that they need. We try to make sure that we've got the support in terms of their career development and training. We don't always get it right, but we'll just try to face up and not ignore these issues. It's a bad problem for startups, and that's where that hustle porn and we're going to go for unicorn status at all costs happens. And everybody, Revolut is a perfect example of this. I like their card, I use them, and then you learn about the work practices that are going on and see what's happening. I canceled, and I think just saying that you're going to take an employee survey and hire somebody to look after HR when you've got hundreds of people is not really the point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that to your point about that support for mental health and well-being, that's something that we can do as teams right from the beginning of our startups. That doesn't have to wait until we have the budget to bring in a specialist, a trained professional like you guys do. For instance, we do feelings check-ins, which sound like, what on earth is that all about? But it's massive for us as a team. So it's just a space where we have a check-in where we are asking how someone is feeling, and we ask until they actually use a feeling. You have no idea how difficult it is to describe an actual emotion rather than, yeah, it's fine, it's sunny today, so things are all right. Or like, well, that's not a feeling. Like, how are you feeling? And it's a space where we're not solving problems. We're not giving you answers. We're not trying to fix anything. It's just your space to say. And when we first started that as a team, that was tough. Some people find it harder than others, or on some days you find it harder than others to answer that. But it's something that's definitely built the trust. So I would say definitely what you guys have going on is great and for the future of startups, but it's something that you can do from the beginning.
I really agree with that. I mean, a lot of times people say all this stuff that we're doing, you can't do on a micro startup, whatever, but actually we put it in place, a lot of this stuff very early on. And a lot of this stuff doesn't cost really any money. It does not cost a lot of money to get a therapist in a couple of days a month. It's a lot cheaper than losing people due to problems. Right, they're off work or burned out or whatever, and their productivity should improve. And even the 4-day work week, that was a cash-free option, right? Like we didn't have to spend any cash on that when we implemented it. So I think it's just about being creative and saying what are the problems we're trying to solve, and what are we trying to achieve with this company. I think in general it washes out.
I think that's a good place to kind of round up and end on, is to turn the creative problem solving that we all do on our products actually to the way that we do business as well, and the way that we interact with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we like to say that our product is our software, but it's also our team, right? That's what you're getting when you buy Administrate. You get our software, and you get our team to help you implement it and use it and so on. And in reality, our product is our people, because the software is made by people, and we've just got to make sure that that's where we live and die. Particularly on the type of software and the type of business we're running, you live or die based on your people, your service, and so on. And so really invest there. And we had a terrible product for a long time at Administrate. It was just bad. What got us through that was our people. And so there we go, Kat.
We knew it would happen.
Yeah, your product is your people at the end of the day.
That's great. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us today. That's John Peebles, CEO of Administrate. And thank you so much for your time. That was great.
All right. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.